Let's talk about it. Jake Lloyd Bacon here to tell you about my podcast, Elaborate, in which talking about it is exactly what we do. Listen, it's not super high concept. It's a talk show. I sit down with artists, actors, comics, and more, and I just try to connect. I try to explore the human condition, figure out why we are who we are, and how the hell we got here. It's a conversation. It's an interview. It's not exactly therapy, but it is often very therapeutic. So check it out. You might get something out of it. It's called Elaborate, and you can find it at elaboratepod.com or wherever you listen to podcasts. It's the greatest mystery in literary history. A divisive question with highly contested answers. Who was the writer behind the pen name William Shakespeare? Welcome to Don't Quill the Messenger. Here's your host, Stephen Sable.
Welcome back, my fellow Quillers, to another wonderful episode of Don't Quill the Messenger. Before I introduce today's guest, who I am very excited to welcome to the program, a little bit of business to go over. I want to remind you that the opinions and statements of the host and guests of this program are completely their own and do not necessarily reflect the positions of our sponsor, the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship. Also, we're human and very fallible, and we make mistakes from time to time, both myself and the guests that I welcome, sometimes about a date, about a person's name, about an attribution. And one of the things that I pride myself on with regards to this series is its overall mission, which is to encourage you, the listener, to go out and do your own research, do your own fact checking. If I say something or a guest says something that seems a little off or weird or incorrect to you, go look it up. That's exactly the point. We want you to go ask your own questions, seek your own answers, and cleave to the truths that speak best to you. With that said, I'd like to introduce our guest for today's episode. He is a Boston-based investigative journalist whose work has appeared in the New York Times, Wired, Slate, the Boston Globe magazine, Boston Magazine, and several other publications. He is the esteemed author of a book called The Map Thief, the gripping story of an esteemed rare map dealer who made millions stealing priceless maps. And that was a New York Times bestseller and NPR Book of the Year. He is also the author of The Coke Machine, The Dirty Truth Behind the World's Favorite Soft Drink. He is a former writing fellow at Brandeis University and the Harvard Kennedy School. He has taught feature writing at Tufts University, Emerson College, and Grub Street Writers. He is also the author of the new book I am holding currently right here in my hands called North by Shakespeare. Please welcome Michael Blanding to the program.
Thanks so much for having me, Stephen. I'm excited for the conversation.
Yes, it's exciting. Great new book, very attractive too, by the way. And I want to thank you for this wonderful hardback edition that I will wonderfully add to my growing library of Shakespeare authorship question works of various scholars throughout the world, in fact. The subtitle of the book is the first thing I'd like to ask you about, because it's called North by Shakespeare. And then you have this subtitle. You're big on subtitles, by the way, aren't you?
I do let the subtitles do a lot of the work. That's for sure.
Yeah. I'm looking at The Map Thief, the gripping story of an esteemed rare map dealer who made millions stealing priceless maps. Thank God it's not the title of a play.
Right.
And here we have North by Shakespeare, a rogue scholar's quest for the truth behind the bard's work. And as you well know, because you've listened to episodes of this program, that's basically the very theme of this program is getting to the bottom of the truth of the Shakespeare authorship question.
Right.
But I'm curious that you refer to the works and so that our audience knows that the rogue scholar you're talking about is Dennis McCarthy.
Mm-hmm.
And even in the jacket of the book, he is referred to as a renegade scholar. So here we call him a rogue scholar, a renegade scholar. Why those choices of words to describe what McCarthy has been doing?
Right. Well, McCarthy is a really interesting character, and I wanted to just get that, in there right off the bat so that readers were aware that he's not coming from a traditional background, and he's not, he didn't grow up in academia. In fact, he didn't graduate college. He was a college dropout and spent a lot of his 20s actually playing ultimate frisbee around the world. And he wasn't a classically trained scholar, but he is sort of one of these polymaths who just is a person who just latches on to whatever subject they're interested in and researches it and goes down these rabbit holes. And that started with science. He spent a number of years writing these papers and books about biology, and then he got on the Shakespeare question about 15 years ago, and he has been obsessed with it ever since. And so, he really comes at it from a different point of view than your traditional academic scholar, and I thought that was really important for readers to know right off the bat.
How did you discover him and his work?
He really discovered me. I had given a talk about my book, The Map Thief, about 6 years ago when it was published, and he sort of cornered me after the talk, and we got to talking, and he invited me out to drinks, and after about the second martini, he suddenly lays in on me with this theory that he has about Shakespeare and about how the plays were written, and we were kind of off to the races after that. He started sending me information. I started looking at it. In the beginning, I really didn't know very much about the authorship question and didn't, frankly, really put much stock in his theories. But the more he sent me and the more I looked at it, and as I started doing my own research, I really felt very compelled by it and wanted to look into it. And eventually it led to writing this book.
Well, he definitely deserves a tip of my hat then for his persistence in pestering an investigative journalist to do some investigation, right? I mean, it seems like what he kept saying to you is keep asking questions. And right. You decided that questions needed to be asked.
Yeah, he is definitely nothing if not persistent. I mean, that is a really a hallmark of him, as a number of investigators into the authorship question are. I know, for all different candidates, but he has really been persistent in following this for the last 15 years or so, and I really felt like his ideas needed to be out there and needed to be heard, that they were a really original take on the authorship question. It wasn't one that I'd heard before, and yet he really hasn't gotten the time of day from the Shakespeare community, and I really felt like that was an injustice that I wanted to see if I could do something about.
So I guess that would lead me to my next curiosity, which is how much knowledge of the Shakespeare authorship question did you have before your association with Dennis? Was it something that you'd learned in passing? Was it something that was brand new to you? What exactly was sort of your basis when he first came to you with his research and his theories?
I didn't have a whole lot of background in it, to be honest. I certainly had studied Shakespeare in college, and I knew the plays fairly well, and I sort of vaguely knew that there were these questions about authorship, and I of course had heard of Oxford and Bacon and these other writers, but I'd never really looked into it. I've never really, frankly, given much stock to it, and it wasn't until I started looking into it as part of this project that I really realized how little we know about Shakespeare, and just how thin Shakespeare's biography is, and that really changed things for me. It wasn't so much researching the authorship question; it was the research that I started doing into Shakespeare, and just realizing that there was a real disconnect between William of Stratford and the plays, and there had to be some other explanation, whether it was the one that Dennis was proposing or other authorship explanations, that I really started to put a lot more stock in it and really start taking it more seriously.
I spent some time in my life as a journalist, not nearly to the esteemed ranks that you have achieved. But I know that in studying the Shakespeare authorship question, and as you say, coming upon the biography of the Stratford man, I think to myself, if I were to hold any of that to the level of scrutiny that most of the editors that I worked beneath throughout my career as a journalist, none of that would ever make it to print. They would be sending me back constantly, find another source, get another attribution, fill in the blanks here because there's just not enough to this story. Did you feel sort of that way yourself as you were investigating the life of the Stratford man?
Yeah, well, this is just the thing, Stephen. I started reading Stephen Greenblatt's Will in the World very early. It's just sort of, okay, I'm going to take this Pulitzer Prize nominated biography, and that's going to be my starting point. And I'm trained as a journalist, so I know all the wiggle words that you can put in to qualify a statement.
Yes,
it was just one after another. Perhaps he did this, and it's very likely he did that, and it takes nothing away from Greenblatt's work, which, from the perspective of the traditional view on Shakespeare, is a really amazing attempt to synthesize the plays with the life, and it's very well written, but. On every page, there were just these qualifications based on, the speculation that just was immediately apparent to me as a journalist and someone who's dealt with that my whole career.
So I'm hearing you say that Dennis turned you into an authorship doubter and a skeptic, and then you delved into this question and did some of your own research on the topic. And at the same time, he's feeding you with his research and his information. But what I'd like to know is, like, when is the moment that you say to yourself, as an accomplished writer, as an accomplished journalist with, several books under your belt already, what is the point that you say to yourself, this needs to be a book, and I'm going to write this book, and I'm going to reach out to this man and ask him for permission to use his research and write this book? And I'm assuming there was a lot of collaboration that had to be involved through the process as well.
Yeah, well, it was a really interesting collaboration because I always treated it as a journalist. I always went in saying, I'm going to be a skeptic, I'm going to ask questions, I'm going to do my own research. I'm not just going to take what Dennis has done as gospel. But, So Dennis's theory, if we can get into a little bit, is that he doesn't believe that there was another author for the plays as such. He doesn't believe that it was, someone like Oxford or Bacon or another writer who was sort of writing the plays and then Shakespeare was up front. He believes that Shakespeare wrote the plays, but he also believes that they were based on these source plays written by this other writer, Sir Thomas North, who, we all know is the writer of the translator of Plutarch's Lives, that Shakespeare's Roman plays are based on. But Dennis has really uncovered all this evidence that Thomas North may have written these earlier source plays that Shakespeare adapted. So he was more an adapter of plays than a writer himself. And so in the research that he did, he actually uncovered this manuscript written by a relative of Thomas North named George North. And he used this computer software to compare it to Shakespeare's plays and identified it as a source for a number of the plays. And that was really my first entry into it. That's what he approached me with first. And I ended up writing this article for the New York Times, and it was actually on the front page of the New York Times, and really got a lot of acclaim from other scholars who said, this is a source for Shakespeare we didn't know about before. This is incredible. This is, quite a find. And then as soon as Dennis started putting forth the other parts of his theory, saying like that, no, Shakespeare didn't use this manuscript as a source, but actually Thomas North used this manuscript and Shakespeare then used Thomas North, he would just get completely shut down and nobody wanted to give him the time of day, and was just getting really personally attacked by other scholars in the mainstream Shakespeare community.
I have no idea what that is like.
You and your listeners are very familiar with. But seeing it from that perspective, just seeing the hypocrisy there, that okay, this one part of his research is fine because it supports this kind of Stratfordian orthodoxy, but this other part is just heresy, and we're going to burn you at the stake. That really inspired me as a journalist, saying, okay, there's something that's not right here. There's something that I need to investigate here. And so that's when I approached Dennis and said, look, I know you're having trouble getting your own book written and getting your own research out there. What if I write the book and I'll follow you around and I can use my cred as a journalist to open some doors and at the same time, get you this hearing. And so we sort of made this kind of pact, I guess, that I would sort of treat it as a journalist, and I would, put some of his research out there, but at the same time, give him a platform that he could get some of his ideas heard.
So that leads me, I have to ask you, since you brought it up, the vilification of those who step outside of the Stratfordian narrative
right.
by standard academia and the orthodoxy is something that everybody who investigates this issue runs into at some point or another.
Sure.
And so I have to ask you if, in reading the book, it seems to me like you're cognitive of that throughout and do your best to, pardon me for saying so, but along these lines, sort of skirt that issue. Like you said, you're the journalist, you know how to use the right words, and you're obviously a magnificent wordsmith. You've made a career in writing. Did you feel that was necessary throughout in order to make the book more palatable to a mainstream consumer and audience?
Yeah, it was a fine line that I walked in writing the book, because as you can tell from talking to me, I mean, just following this research made me into a Shakespeare doubter, and I certainly keep an open mind. I won't say that I'm 100% on board with the Thomas North train, and I keep an open mind to alternative theories as well. But I think that it's very hard for me to conceive that Shakespeare and Shakespeare alone wrote the plays, having looked into it to the degree that I had. And so it was really kind of a fine line of saying, there's something there, there's something compelling. I'm going to give you the evidence, reader, and you decide and you make up your own mind about it. But at the same time, as you'll see, I sort of take jabs at Shakespeare and Stratfordian orthodoxy throughout, and really question the kind of orthodox views. And I feel like as a journalist, as an investigative reporter, I never pretend to be unbiased. I think that that even the word unbiased, I don't think it really exists in journalism. But I try to be transparent, and I try to be clear with the reader where I stand, and hopefully I achieve that throughout the book.
And I think that's a very admirable, especially in today's day and age where we're finding less and less of that. And you and I, I'm sure, could go into an entire separate hour about the state of journalism today,
sure,
and what it has become. But I'm glad to hear you say that, because that was definitely the way I was trained in my early career as a journalist as well, was that, there's a difference between reporting and editorializing. Mm-hmm. And I think those lines have become so blurred in modern times that we've lost sight of that. And so I'm not meaning to jab at you for not choosing a side openly in the book. I was just curious if you felt like there was sort of a need to keep the book commercially acceptable in order to open more minds than it might if you pushed the envelope a little further north, pardon the pun.
Yeah. Well, I think, by the last chapter of the book, I really kind of lay my cards on the table and I say, okay, look, I wouldn't have written the book if I didn't think there was something there. And I think the question is how much is there, and how, how much of what Dennis had put forward is the truth, or are there other explanations that could also fit with his hypothesis? But just the amount of evidence that he's uncovered, there's clearly a much stronger connection between Shakespeare and North than has ever been acknowledged before. And so I kind of lay out the evidence at the end, and I say, if none of this is true, then there's an awful lot of coincidences here, and it really needs to be explored.
Have you suffered a lot of backlash since the book has come out? How are things in your circles now?
Yeah, it's been really interesting. I watched Dennis get these kind of personal attacks from, really kind of nasty, in some cases, attacks from scholars, and knew that I would be sort of opening myself up to that by publishing this book. And for the most part, I have to say the reviews have been good for the book, and most of the most of the reviews I'm getting on Amazon, most of the reviews I'm getting in the press have been good, but there have been a few that, oh man, I was not prepared for this level of vitriol and, real kind of personal swipes that have been leveled against me, leveled against Dennis, that just seem to have come out of nowhere. And it just shows you the emotional quality of people's feelings about Shakespeare that, wow, I had no idea before.
I think it's interesting because for many of us who have come to the Shakespeare authorship question, regardless of what camp we're in, whether it's Oxfordian, Baconian, Marlovian, Northian. I guess we're going to invent the word Northian now.
I believe it's
regardless
Northern
of what
Dennis's preferred.
Oh, is it Northern?
Northern, yes.
I like that. Actually, that is a better wordsmithing there. I agree. But all of us who have come to this, we have all in one way or another suffered such attacks. And no matter how much we can rationally absorb those in a logical mind and say, well, this is just proof of how frightened they are by what we are revealing and exposing, it somehow does not still soften the sting. Especially when people, when the ad hominems come flying on such a personal level that are completely off point and completely off topic and have nothing to do with the issue. Right. Which, any smart debater knows that's when the person on the other side is admitting defeat, but it doesn't change the fact that it's barbed and sharp and still has a sting.
Yeah. No, it's so true. I mean, I was ready for people to, check me on dates or facts or things like that, or say this play doesn't mean what you say it is. But, when they start actually, attacking me as a writer or attacking Dennis, as a person, it's just really, really over the line. And like I say, even though I was expecting it, I was not prepared for what it felt like when it started happening. But it does. You're right. It makes me feel like I'm onto something here, and that these are alternative points of view that need to be told.
And so basically, just for our listeners who don't have the book yet, and I encourage them all, go out and get it. You can find it at all of your regular booksellers, especially on Amazon. But if you don't want to feed the Bezos god, you can probably find it at other sources as well. Sure. It is North by Shakespeare, Michael Blanding, spelled Blanding. It won't be hard for you to find. I encourage everybody to go out and get it and read it and expand their horizons further into this. There are some Oxfordians, of course, who I'm sure will read it and be threatened by it as well. I choose to take a different perspective. I choose to see it as just another chink in the Stratfordian armor. And I personally believe that it helps bolster the Oxfordian case. If you replace the Stratfordian man with Oxford, you are not minimizing North's contribution to the works, which I believe is obviously there and very evident.
Yeah. Well, that's just it. I have been talking with some Oxfordians. I've been chatting on some of the Oxford web pages with people, and I think that there's a lot that Oxfordians can learn from Northerns, and Northerns could learn from Oxfordians. Dennis has relied on a lot of the pioneering research of a lot of Oxfordian scholars in putting together some of these pieces himself. And, I read numerous Oxfordian biographies myself, and I think that where you come down at the end of the day is a matter of personal opinion, and we may not agree on everything. But I think that there's a lot that the two sides can learn from each other. And I've had much more fruitful conversations with Oxfordians than I have with Stratfordians at this point, at least.
Of course, and I'm gonna take a shot in the dark guess. I've never professed to be much of a scholar or a researcher. I'm an entertainer, quite honestly. But I'm going to take a shot in the dark guess that some of my Oxfordian friends are going to take the connection that exists between John Lilly's style and North, and then immediately draw the conclusion of, well, wait a minute, we know for a fact Lilly's connection to Oxford. And that creates a triangle that is easy to seal.
Yeah.
Whereas the Stratford man doesn't fit anywhere in that triangle or anywhere in that circle. And that's been one of the biggest issues for a very long time is that you have all these writers who were obviously influenced by a certain stylometric that North sort of advanced with his translations. And I think that that's definitely true and evident. And I think you see it in other writers who you can easily connect to Oxford, but there's no way to connect them at all to the Stratford man.
Yeah, and Dennis has done a lot of research on that. I don't go into that in a huge amount of detail in my book. I really focus on the life of Thomas North and how it's reflected in the plays and the sort of parallel story about the life of Dennis McCarthy and his attempts to kind of get this point of view out there and get people to listen to him. But Dennis has done a lot of research about John Lilly, for example, and even North's connection with Oxford. And, he has a slightly different point of view, which is that North and Oxford were really on opposing sides of court factions, and that a lot of the Oxfordian references in the plays are really inserted by North as a way to attack Oxford and mock Oxford. And so Dennis would definitely not subscribe to the point of view that Oxford was adapting North, for example. But certainly the connection there is really fascinating, and the fact that John Lilly was really developed his style from reading Thomas North, and it's very well known by scholars that Lilly's style was came from North's translation, The Dial of Princes, in the 1550s, and that's how we developed this, euphuism, however you pronounce that word. And
I have trouble with it too. Don't feel bad. It's one of the reasons why I haven't mentioned it yet. It's Lilly's greatest work, I believe, is that it's Euphues. My friend Dr. Earl Showerman would probably know the exact proper pronunciation of that. But I always mess it up. But don't feel bad. That's okay. We're in the same camp.
Okay, great. Yeah, and I can't go into a whole lot of detail on this because, as I said, I don't really talk about it too much in the book. But I know that Dennis has a whole, I keep trying to get him to write this down and to share it with the Oxford community, because I think there'd be a fascinating conversation about these connections. And he has done a lot of research into it. But where I focus, I just vaguely touch on Oxford in the book, but where I really focus is on looking at the life and writings of Thomas North and how Dennis has seen that reflected in the plays, and there's some really fascinating correspondences there.
So one of the things about this series that I'm super proud of is that we have a lot of listeners who haven't been studying this for 10, 15, 20 years. In fact, many of them are very new to this question. Some of them have discovered the podcast through just doing podcast searches. Some of them have discovered the podcast because a friend recommended it to them. Some of them discovered it because they listened to another podcast on the network that we're a part of. And so they're not tried and trues. They're not, entrenched in this, and they have a lot of questions and a lot of curiosities. And so for those people, I try to be that voice whenever I can when I have a guest on the series. And one question I would think that people who are listening right now would ask is, how many plays exist with Thomas North's name on them?
Right. It's a very good question. And the answer to that question is 0. And that is one of the main attacks that Dennis has faced from scholars, is that he has, basically speculated on the existence of these source plays that Thomas North wrote that Shakespeare adapted, and these plays don't exist. There's no hard and fast evidence that Thomas North was even a playwright, and that is, on the face of it, would seem to disqualify him right there. But when you start looking at, first of all, as you know, most of the plays that were written at the time no longer exist, and only a very small fraction, maybe 10% of the manuscript plays are do we even know about today? And the other point that Dennis raises is that there are all these source plays that are in the record, that these names of these earlier plays that are lost, but we know a little bit about them. We know about their plots, we know about their names, and scholars have even speculated that a number of them were actually used by Shakespeare to write his plays. And so where Dennis comes in is saying these source plays were all written by the same person, and that's Sir Thomas North. So it's not quite as outlandish a theory as it first appears, but it's really, the evidence that he uses to support Thomas North as a playwright comes from Thomas North's prose writings and these translations that he wrote, Plutarch's Lives, The Dial of Princes, and this third translation called The Moral Philosophy of Donne. And it's those works that he really sees reflected in the plays to a really astonishing degree. And that's what his argument is based on.
And you do have some appendices in the back of the appendix.
Appendices.
See, there's another one. Appendices. You do have a few appendices in the back, and including some side-by-sides that demonstrate some writings by North. And then in the next panel next to that are, from the Shakespearean canon. Not something that we haven't seen before, especially those who are interested in this question. My friend Roger Stripmatter would say, well, I can certainly throw a bunch of Oxfordian early writings right next to the writings of Shakespeare and do the same thing. So I don't know that that's sort of like a smoking gun that would sway people one way or another to North or to Oxford, in the sense that if you can do that with one, you can do that with another. You can probably do that with another. And stylometrics is not a new thing. It's something that's, been around in this question for quite some time. And the computer software that's been used has been used to both prove Shakespeare was Shakespeare and prove that Shakespeare was not Shakespeare and prove that this person was Shakespeare. It's been used a lot throughout the history of this question. I think what probably is the crux here that I'm curious most about, and that I would think is probably the cause of the great vitriol that you've been suffering, is the moment you start calling the writer an adapter instead of a writer is the moment that, hairs stand up on the backs of necks and people get their feathers bristled. Is, well, wait a minute. You're basically saying that he was just a plagiarist, just an adapter, and didn't actually create anything. Would you say that sort of sums up the position, or no?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I will say that when it comes to the textual comparisons that McCarthy did, I do think that they're pretty astonishing in terms of their sheer number. And, it's something I couldn't go into in the book because, it would make for a very boring narrative for me to just, print table after table after table. But I would encourage people to go to his website, which is sirthomasnorth.com. And he has, literally hundreds of these passages. And what was more convincing to me than just seeing these parallel phrases was that they were occurring within these passages in which there would be a number of phrases in common, and then they were sort of expressing a very similar idea. And so, like there's a passage from Richard II that is expressing the idea of grief being like seeing things through water and seeing them very distorted. And then it uses this very rare phrase to dissolve the bands of life. And so if you just saw that, to dissolve the bands of life, you'd say, okay, two people could use that phrase. It's not that spectacular. But then you say, how likely is it that they're going to use that phrase and they're also going to use it in a passage about grief, also making the point about, looking at things in this distorted way. And that's just one example of, literally hundreds of passages that McCarthy has found. And so, either Shakespeare or Oxford or whoever wrote the plays was really obsessed with the writings of Thomas North and really, relied on them for all the plays, or McCarthy's onto something and Thomas North was the author itself. But I think when you see the sheer number of them, it's really hard just to say, okay, this is a coincidence that, could be like any writer. So I want to put that out there, right from the beginning. But then, yeah, I think that to your larger point that, really the problem that McCarthy has had, because in some ways he believes Shakespeare wrote the plays, so why wouldn't he be accepted? But it's this idea that he was this adapter and that he didn't sort of create the plays, out of the genius of, this, Shakespeare, this godlike genius that we all sort of, grew up with, this image of Shakespeare that, people get really emotional and really attached to. That's what has really shut him down and really really caused that sort of ire at him from the Shakespearean community.
I've been a theater artist for almost 40 years now. In fact, this summer I will celebrate my 40th anniversary of the first performance I ever performed on stage at the tender age of 9, by the way, because I'm not that old. But it wasn't until much later in life, obviously, that I, as a producer and director and an artistic director of my own theater, started adapting works. So I have some experience with what it's like to take a work written by someone else and adapt it for a modern audience or a new audience. But when I take a play, for instance, if I take a play by Euripides, which I have done, and I take a translation from more than 100 years ago because it's now in the public domain, and then I adapt it to my stage, my production that I'm putting on at my little black box theater in LA when I was doing that, I would never suppose to put, Antigone by Stephen Sable. It just wouldn't, it's just not something I would ever do. It would be, adapted by. And so you don't think that, I don't know what the rules were back then. I don't know that anyone ever put adapted by on anything back then in the Elizabethan times. But truthfully, I'm not a dramatist. I have written a couple of original works. They're not very good. I'm not a dramatist. I can turn a phrase. I've made quite a living off of being a writer, but I'm not a dramatist. And so I'm wondering if what we have here is this disconnect between this, great prose translator and some dramatist who is using this great work. And certainly whoever wrote the works of Shakespeare was a huge fan of great writing, because it's not just North's work that we can point to. There's so many other source works that we can point to in the Shakespearean canon that whoever wrote these works had access to great works of literature of the day in multiple languages too. And I think then that disqualifies the Stratford man completely in my mind. But it doesn't disqualify North as an incredible source of these works.
It's certainly one point of view, and I can understand why as an Oxfordian, you would believe that, or why other Oxfordians might want to see it that way, and you could very well be right. I mean, I'm not going to come out here as a journalist and tell you that you're wrong, but I think that from Dennis's point of view anyway, there's a couple of things that are wrong with that, and it has to do with the context for writing the plays and how they sort of line up with the sources of the other sources of the plays, the contemporary references about these source plays, and then how they really line up with Thomas North's life and the preoccupations of his life and the preoccupations of his patron, the Earl of Leicester, who I'm sure as one of Oxford's great enemies. North was in this circle with Leicester, and there are all of these references that McCarthy has been able to identify that really line up with North's life in an uncanny way. And of course, you can do the same thing with Oxford, and some of the references are even the same. And that to me really it says that doubters in general are onto something if you're sort of looking at it from two points of view and finding these similar references. But I think from McCarthy's point of view,
it is interesting the parallels in those two lives. The Earl of Oxford and Thomas North did have some very similar life experiences in their own biographies. If you just laid the biographies of those two men side by side,
Right.
it is very interesting, the mirrors that you can find there. And one of the things I also find very interesting is they both die in the same year.
Right.
And both at younger age. Now, Thomas North was an older, slightly older man than Oxford, but they both die in 1604, and I found that very interesting in my research into the topic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think their lives do overlap in some interesting ways, and as I said, some of the references that have been identified by Oxfordians could also apply to Thomas North. For example, in The Merchant of Venice, I'm very interested that Oxfordians have basically dated it to the same time as Dennis has, that there's all these references in The Merchant of Venice to the politics of what was going on in the Netherlands in 1578. And, once you look at it in those terms, it's sort of obvious. There was a reference to this play called The Jew in 1579, and the last source that we know of that for The Merchant of Venice was in 1577. So it really kind of pinpoints 1578. And then you see all these references to, these suitors of Portia in the play that are kind of these veiled references to the various players in the war in the Netherlands. And, it becomes just so apparent that you're dealing with an earlier play here and whoever wrote it. And then, the additional layer that Dennis has put onto it is that, what was happening in 1578 was the Queen's progress was, she took this progress to Norfolk that actually went to the North family estate, and she stayed at the home of his brother. And at the time, there were all of these sort of masks that all the wealthy lords were giving for Queen Elizabeth, where they were presenting her with these gifts and these jewels, and the Thomas North's brother Roger gave her this really expensive jewel. And if you look at the play The Merchant of Venice, there's this moment in the play where sort of everything's building up to this mask that they're going to perform, and then there's this kind of strange line where they're just like, oh, the wind changed, we're not going to hold the mask tonight. And what Dennis sort of has interpreted from that is that, that was the moment when Roger North was going to present the Queen with this jewel. And if you look at the play, the word jewel in it is just there over and over. It's like 25 times in the last act of the play they use the word jewel. And so, it's speculation, of course, and you could speculate in a number of different ways, but it's really, it's fascinating to look at it from different points of view and to match it up with the life of Thomas North in the same way that other folks have matched it up with the life of Oxford and McCarthy's able to do this for play after play after play in a really compelling way.
When I receive mail from our listeners, which I love to get, by the way, and fellow Quillers, please send me your emails, send me your suggestions for future episodes. We love to hear from you. But when I receive emails from our listeners, one of the common themes that they want to know more about is the autobiographical nature of the plays.
Mm-hmm.
If there was one play that you felt was the most autobiographical for Thomas North, which play would you say that is?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, each one of the plays, at least in Dennis's figuring, really has a significance to Thomas North's life. I'll say two because they're the two that are commonly held up as the most autobiographical, which is Hamlet and The Tempest. And I think whether you're a Baconian or an Oxfordian, those are always the plays that you're sort of grappling with. And, McCarthy's interpretation of Hamlet is really fascinating because there's this reference to the Hamlet in 1589, and the year before was the invasion of the Spanish Armada. And Thomas North was actually a captain during the Armada, and he was put in charge of guarding these Catholic recusants. And so there was all this, worry, as you know, that the recusants were going to kind of rise up and the Spanish were going to attack. And, he was really in this kind of precarious position. And, if you look at the beginning of Hamlet, there's this kind of invasion that's going to occur by sea from the north. And people were worried, is James of Scotland going to come and avenge his mother, Mary, Queen of Scots, who was executed the year before? And there's all these sort of strange eclipses in the plays. And that was happening as well at the time. And so there's all these elements that sort of seem to relate to the Spanish Armada that scholars have identified, but no one is really... in the traditional dating of the play, no one has been able to explain why. And then you have, Hamlet as this character who's sort of, facing his own mortality and asking, whether, he should take up arms against the Sea of Trouble, whether, he should stay and fight against his uncle or just give in. And so McCarthy sort of interprets that as North sort of on the brink of this war. And of course, Oxfordians I know have all kinds of other interpretations for Hamlet, which McCarthy also believes that maybe North was sort of mocking Oxford in the portrait of Polonius. So there were some sort of Oxfordian references that he was putting in as a way to sort of mock Oxford at the same time he was dealing with his own dilemma. And so that becomes a really sort of compelling new interpretation of the play that I found really fascinating. And then The Tempest, I'll just say, just really briefly, is all about, Prospero's kind of revenge against his brother and his decision at the end to kind of be merciful to his brother. And there was all kinds of conflict between North and his brother his entire life, where Roger was this really headstrong lord, and he was... Thomas was sort of disowned by his father, and then later was sort of disowned by his brother, and all the time was sort of given, this pittance of an allowance. And, you see this in a number of the plays, this conflict between brothers and As You Like It, or as in, some of the history plays. But it's really in The Tempest that it really kind of comes to a head, and you have this, very bookish Lord Prospero, who's disinherited and sent to this island with his books, and then confronts his brother who's usurped him, and at the end sort of decides to forgive him, and that McCarthy believes was written the year after Roger died, and was sort of Thomas coming to terms with his brother's death and deciding at the end of his life to forgive his brother. And it's a really poignant moment when you look at it that way. And again, it's just interpretation based on North's life and on various passages in his writings. But I do find it really, really compelling, and really kind of makes me see the play in a new way.
Well, I think one of the great things about the Shakespeare authorship question, regardless of which camp people land in, when you attach yourself to another candidate who does have this rich history and this rich autobiography, or not autobiography, but biography, and then you try to connect the plays in an autobiographical way, I think that Shakespeare files of all sizes, sorts, ages, and backgrounds can enjoy the plays 10 times more than trying to connect them to the tissue that is the man from Stratford. It's not possible to do. You just can't have that same rich enjoyment. And it's a theme that I touch on here on the program quite often. Yeah. As I mentioned, other great writers throughout history whose lives that we know a lot about and help us to then understand the works that they wrote, and the list is, 1,000 pages long of great writers.
Right.
What would Thoreau have been without his experiences in New England, kind of thing? What would Poe have been without all the great tragic loss that he suffered and his addiction to drugs? What would Steinbeck have been without the Great Dust Bowl and depression? It goes on and on and on and on and on.
Right. No, I totally agree. And Dennis makes that point too, and says, imagine sort of, mixing up Mark Twain and Dostoevsky, and having Mark Twain write about, prison camp in Siberia, and Dostoevsky write about, a riverboat on the Mississippi. It doesn't work. People draw from their own experiences.
That's a great example, actually.
The fact that
I love that.
Yeah. I mean, it only makes sense. And the fact that, North and Oxford both traveled in Italy and had, experiences with Commedia dell'arte and these Italianate cities. And so, of course, that someone would have to have that experience to write these rich plays. You couldn't be getting all that from, travelers at, the Oliphant or something. So it just makes a lot of sense to me. Whoever the candidate is, as you say, they would be drawing from their own experience. And as you say, it just makes it so much deeper and more resonant when you feel that in the writing.
So I know when we were scheduling this episode, we talked a little bit about trying to get both you and Dennis in the same room together for this episode, and that was just not semantically possible. And I'd love to have an opportunity to speak with him in the future. But the one question that now is banging me on the head, and my friend John Shahan from the Shakespeare Authorship Coalition will be happy that I'm about to put you on the spot and ask you this question. Why have neither of you signed the Declaration of Reasonable Doubt? Because it sounds to me like you both have very reasonable doubt that this guy from Stratford was the true author. Maybe he was just an adapter. Maybe he was just a front man of some sort or another. Have you been to doubtaboutwill.org? And what do you think about adding your name to that list?
That's really funny. As a journalist, I tend not to sign anything. I always get people coming to my door with petitions for causes and things. And I guess I'm just trained as a journalist, even if I write about something that, I have a hard time sort of attaching my name to a cause. I don't make political donations to issues or anything like that. But I think so. I guess it just didn't occur to me to sign it. But you're right. I mean, I do certainly have a reasonable doubt. So I'd have to think about it. But I don't think I'd have any problem with signing that.
Well, good idea. Then you and anybody else who's listening can go to doubtaboutwill.org. Doubtaboutwill.org is a very easy website to find. And, one of the things about the Declaration of Reasonable Doubt is it does not point to any specific writer. Right. It basically says that more research is needed here, that this question is valid, that it requires inquiring minds like yours, like investigative journalists with a pedigree like yours, like artists like me who love these works and inquire about them from an artistic standpoint of producing, directing, and acting in them, that scholars, historians, doctors, lawyers, anybody who has an interest in how this. You talked earlier in the program, you mentioned that Dennis was a polymath. If the writer of Shakespeare is not the greatest polymath of all time, I don't know who is.
Right.
And so any of us, all of us who have an inquiry should join at least in encouraging the world to continue to ask these questions, which is obviously, as you know, one of the great themes of this series. So I encourage you and anybody who's listening, go to doubtaboutwill.org and consider signing the Declaration of Reasonable Doubt.
Yeah, well, that's definitely a point of view I can get behind. I mean, as you say, there's just so many discrepancies here that really need to be taken seriously by the mainstream Shakespeare community and wherever they land on them, there has to be more of an explanation than just, the man from Stratford writing these plays full form. So that I can completely agree with.
One of the other questions that I had in reading the book and preparing for today's episode is I wondered why, if the Stratford man is the true author, he is the William Shakespeare that we believe is the creator of all of the works attributed to that name, why would he dedicate, say, the first two pieces of work that have that name on them, Venus and Adonis and The Rape of Lucrece, to the Earl of Southampton, but then not dedicate any of the other works to Sir Thomas North, if he indeed was stealing from Thomas North and adapting North's works? And then later on, when the sonnets are published, also in obvious tribute to Southampton, do we have any kind of connection between North and Southampton to any degree? And why would this writer not acknowledge this contributor of all of this source who was alive during some of the publications of these works, according to your timeline?
Right. Yeah, there's a lot of questions there to unpack, but to take the easiest one for me first, which will probably be the least satisfying answer to you, is that I don't look at the poems at all in my book. And that was something very deliberate when I talked to Dennis and when I first agreed with him that I was going to do this project. That was the one thing he asked me. He does have, he has written a lot about it and researched a lot about it, but he said, he wanted to keep that and kind of, as his baby, he wanted to reveal that later in the fullness of time. And so, frankly, I had my hands full with the plays, but I don't even know what his theory is on the sonnets. And all I know is that he has one. But in terms of the other question about, why wouldn't Shakespeare have given Thomas North credit? I think that, from what I've learned about the way that the plays were written at the time, the whole concept of plagiarism really wasn't a thing. I mean, the word plagiarism doesn't even exist until 1598, well into Shakespeare's career. And North would have been, as a gentleman, he would have been much more focused on his legacy as a prose writer and as a translator of these great works, and wouldn't want to be associated with these plays that, during his time, sort of an older generation, most plays were published anonymously anyway. And so if you look at, that's one answer, but then if you look at the Shakespeare's first few plays, they actually don't say by William Shakespeare. They say, newly augmented and corrected by William Shakespeare, or some kind of language like that actually implies that they are an adaptation of an earlier play. And it's only later when Shakespeare starts getting this kind of fame as a theater producer and as a part owner of the Lord Chamberlain's Men that you start seeing, by William Shakespeare. And, my understanding is that was something that could have been done legitimately at the time, that, everyone was kind of borrowing from everyone and everyone was kind of taking each other's work and rewriting it and, putting their name on it. But at the same time, you have all of these references to Shakespeare that imply that people weren't all that happy about it. And Grote's Worth of Wit, for example, that calls Shakespeare an upstart crow and says he's feathering his nest with the plumage of other writers. And so even if Thomas North was happy to sort of legitimately sell his plays to Shakespeare to be adapted, that there's some indication that were other writers that were maybe not too happy about it, or didn't think that he was sort of legitimately adapting, legitimately putting his name on these adaptations. And Dennis has done a lot of work in sort of unpacking all of these kind of satirical references to Shakespeare, in which he points to a number of references that do apply to North and are puns on the name North, or puns on his various translations at the times, that are sort of presented in a way with Shakespeare's plays that implies that Shakespeare was sort of taking North's writings and making them his own. So it is there if you know where to look, but it's just not there on the cover pages of the plays. And I realize that's a long-winded answer and maybe not a very satisfying answer, but that's the best that I've been able to understand it in terms of Dennis's theory, and it seems to fit with the way that plays were written at the time.
Well, one thing I can say, Michael, after this conversation today is that we may be approaching this from different angles, but we are definitely not in different camps. And like I continually beat on my drum, the whole goal is to try to get to the truth. And what it requires is more inquiry, more people like yourself, like me, like our listeners, who are interested in solving what I believe is the greatest literary mystery of all time. And I believe that your book helps contribute to the conversation and the dialogue that is necessary to get to that truth. And I found it fascinating in many ways that if nothing else, regardless of what camp my listeners are in, when they go and they buy the book and they read the book, one thing is for certain is it is going to satisfy a greater connection to North in the works that are attributed to the author William Shakespeare, pseudonym or not. And I don't think there's anything bad with that. I think it's been out there for a long time. We've all known that North's Plutarch's Lives has been a huge source. In fact, in Antony and Cleopatra, which is one of the most difficult plays to produce and direct, by the way, I have to tell you, It's like 12 locations in that damn play.
Right.
But in that play, there are sections of North that are almost word for word.
Yeah.
And so that would lend a great level of credibility to Dennis's research and to your book and its findings. So that cannot be denied.
And
so,
Dennis,
like I say,
and as Dennis points out, that's the only writer that Shakespeare ever does that with. That there's no other writer that he takes like Plutarch's Lives and Antony and Cleopatra and Julius Caesar and actually puts these passages in almost verbatim. So that alone, so it shows you there's some connection there, and how far people want to push that connection is up to them.
Well, it's fascinating research, and kudos to you for stepping up the way that you have with, as you said earlier in the interview, you added your journalist cred to Dennis's efforts, and now this book exists and it's out there. And I apologize for the suffering that you will endure, but welcome to the club.
Yeah. Well, in part, I'm used to it as a journalist, but I have to say Shakespeareans are a rare breed. I mean, I've written about, gun rights issues in the past. And so, I'm no stranger to being personally attacked, but it really has been another level with this. So I guess welcome to the club.
That's right. You have a new badge of honor, my friend, that we can share together. And I'm pleased to share that badge of honor with you. And I want to thank you for being here and for giving us your time and for answering so honestly and candidly about where you came from with this and where you're at with it. And before I let you go, is there anything that I didn't ask that I should have asked that's important that you'd like the listeners to know before we sign off?
No, I mean, I just want to say that I really enjoyed talking to you about this, and I've really enjoyed, since the book has come out, talking with other Oxfordians and other doubters about these issues. And, I've learned things even since the book came out about this. So, I would really encourage people to buy the book or take it out of the library and check out Dennis's website, sirthomasnorth.com. And let's keep the conversation going and let's see where it leads.
Well, thank you so much, Michael. And we will look forward to seeing your name added to the Declaration of Reasonable Doubt in the coming future, and Dennis as well. And I will be bothering you offline about helping me set up a subsequent episode with Dennis, because I'd love to talk to him more about his research as well.
Yeah, no, I think you should. And I think he can get a lot more into the nitty gritty of some of the evidence that he's found. So I think you'd have a lot of fun talking to him.
Fantastic. It is North by Shakespeare, a rogue scholar's quest for the truth behind the bard's work by Michael Blanding. You can find it at all of your traditional booksellers. Please add it to your library. We thank our special guest, Michael Blanding, for giving us the hour to talk about this book. Want to remind you, fellow Quillers, that Don't Quill the Messenger is sponsored by the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship, ShakespeareOxfordFellowship.org, ShakespeareOxfordFellowship.org, your source and resource for everything Shakespeare authorship question. Please go and peruse the website. Do your own research. Ask your own questions. Find the answers to those questions and attach to the truth that speaks to you the most. That is the way that we will move this pendulum further in the direction of the truth of who really deserves the credit for the greatest works of English literature ever written. If you have comments, please reach out to us. Contact at don'tquillthepodcast.com. Contact at don'tquillthepodcast.com. Love to hear from you. Send us your suggestions, comments, criticisms. We'll take those too. We love to get some feedback from our listeners. We thank you for taking the time to listen to this series wherever you are in 46 different countries around the world. We're glad to have you as listeners, and we hope you'll join us again for another episode of Don't Quill the Messenger. In the meantime, keep asking questions.
If you've enjoyed today's episode, please leave a rating and review in your podcast player. For even more, visit our website, don'tquillthepodcast.com. There you can find official merchandise in our shop, as well as a link to our Patreon. This show is made possible by people like you. We hope you'll consider showing your support by becoming a monthly patron, where you'll receive bonus material and tons of exclusive perks. You can also join in the conversation on our Discord and by following us at Don't Quill the Pod on all social media. All of this can be found at don'tquillthepodcast.com, don'tquillthepodcast.com.
Dragon Wagon.